The summer of 1,886 inches, Cass County, Dakota Territory, hit 103 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 straight days in July. The sky was the color of old bone, no wind, no clouds, pressing down on every farmstead from Fargo to the Nebraska line. By the third week of August, something started happening inside the smokehouses. Not all of them, and not even most of them, but enough that by the time the first real frost came in October, 3 families on the Elm Creek Road had already lost their entire winter meat supply to rot. Oscar Brandt found his hams in the second week of September. He'd built his smokehouse the same way his father had built one in Wisconsin, the same way every man in the settlement had built one, 4 walls of rough pine planking, a dirt floor, iron hooks in the rafters, a small fire pit in the corner. He'd smoked 4 hogs in April. Good hogs, properly salted, properly hung. He checked them in September and found them soft in the middle, grey-green near the bone, smelling like something that had died twice. His neighbour, Carl Reinhardt, lost 2 hams and a full side of bacon. Dirk Magnusson lost everything he'd put up, 6 months of pork, all of it lost. These were not careless men, and they were not strangers to preservation. They had done this before, in other places, in other years. What none of them understood yet was that the Dakota summer of 1,886 was not Wisconsin, not Minnesota, not Indiana. The temperatures inside an above-ground pine smokehouse on the open Dakota plains in July were hitting 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the afternoon. And at 115 degrees Fahrenheit, everything they thought they knew about smoking meat stopped working. 2 miles east of the Brandt claim, on a piece of ground that nobody had wanted and everybody had said was too low and too wet to be worth filing on, a 3-4-year-old widow named Sofie Karas had been doing something that every man in the settlement had already laughed at. She had built her smokehouse in a way that looked wrong to everyone who saw it, dug into a hill, half underground, with a clay-lined trench running 15 feet from an external fire pit to the chamber. There were no pine boards and no iron roof. She'd sunk the structure like a root cellar, with a sod cap and a drainage ditch around the perimeter, and she'd oriented the fire pit on the north side so the prevailing June wind didn't push hot air straight into the chamber. Lars Dybvig, who ran the hardware concern in the settlement and fancied himself an authority on everything built above ground, had watched her digging in May and told her, loudly enough that 4 other men could hear, that she was wasting her time in a hole in the ground like a mole. "Smoke rises," he said. "You'll get no smoke in there. You'll get cold meat and wasted wood." Sofie Karas said nothing and went back to digging. By October of 1886, when the Brandt and Reinhardt and Magnusson hams were already wrapped in burlap and buried against the smell, Sofie Karas had 9 hams and 14 slabs of bacon hanging in her underground chamber, every one of them solid and dry and smelling of hickory and salt. When Lars Dybvig came to ask her, very quietly, whether she had any salt pork she'd be willing to sell at a fair price, she did. She charged him what the hams were worth, not a cent less than the Fargo market price. This is the story of how she built it, why it worked, and why the physics that saved her meat in 1886 is still the physics that every serious cold smoking operation in the world runs on today. Sofie Varga arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1882 as Sofie Karas, married 3 weeks before departure from Bohemia. She was 30 years old. Her husband, Jerry Karas, was 41, a carpenter by trade, a man who'd spent 11 years in the Austrian timber trade and who had opinions about wood and joinery that he shared frequently and at length. They'd left Bohemia in February, crossed to Hamburg, sailed from Hamburg on the SS Lahn in March, and made Bismarck by the first week of April, with $214 between them, $214 after 6 weeks of travel, which was enough to file a homestead claim, buy seed, purchase a draft horse named Ida, and have approximately $38 left over for everything else. The land they filed on, Section 14 of Township 141 North, Range 49 West in Cass County, was not what Geary had imagined when he'd read the Northern Pacific Railroad's promotional pamphlets in Prague. The pamphlets had described the finest wheat country in the known world. What they got was 160 acres of slightly low ground with a seasonal creek running through the northwest corner that flooded 2 inches deep, every spring for about 3 weeks. The topsoil was decent and the drainage was acceptable after the spring melt, but the ground was wet enough in May that the neighbours to the north, the Brandt family, had looked at it and filed on the higher ground instead. Geary built a sod house first, because there was no other choice. He built a small barn for Ida and the 2 sows they bought from a Norwegian farmer named Strand the following spring. He broke 40 acres in the first year, 60 inches the second. By 1884, they had wheat coming in, a kitchen garden, 2 more sows, and the beginning of what might have been a solid small farm in another 5 years. In September of 1884, Sofie Karas cut his left hand on a wood saw, not badly enough to stop working. Badly enough that by the following week the hand was red to the elbow, and by the week after that he had a fever that wouldn't break. It was blood poisoning, and the doctor in Fargo was 22 miles away. By the time someone made the round trip, Geary was already delirious. He died on October 3rd, 1884. Sofie was 32 years old. She had 2 sows, 1 draft horse, $6.40 in cash, 60 acres of wheat that needed harvesting, and a homestead claim that required her to continue improving and residing on the land for 3 more years or lose everything. She hired 2 men to get the wheat in. That cost $4 of the $6.40. She got through the first winter on stored grain, smoked pork from the previous spring's hog, and credit at Dybvig's hardware store that she paid back in May with wheat money. What she'd learned in that first winter alone was something that took most people longer to figure out, that the smokehouse Geary had built, a simple above-ground pine shed on the south side of the barn, was going to be the variable that determined whether she made it or not. If her meat held through summer, she had food through winter. If it didn't, she was buying food she couldn't afford from people who already doubted she'd last another year. She spent the winter of 1884-85 thinking about the smokehouse. Not in the way Geary had thought about it as a structure to build correctly according to what he already knew, but as a problem to solve from first principles, starting with the question of why the hams sometimes went wrong. She'd grown up in a village in Bohemia where every family cured pork in autumn, and she had a clear memory of which families lost meat and which didn't. The ones who lost it, she'd noticed as a girl, were usually the ones whose smokehouses were small and tight and built into sun-facing slopes where the afternoon heat built up. The ones who kept their meat through the following summer were the ones with larger, cooler, shadier chambers. She had never had a name for what she was observing, she just remembered it. The spring of 1885 was when she started asking different questions. The seasonal creek in the northwest corner of her claim ran colder than you'd expect well into June. She'd stepped into it once in early June wearing her work boots, and the water had chilled her to the knee in 30 seconds. She noticed that the soil along the bank, 2 feet below the surface, stayed damp and cool all summer. She noticed that the earthen root cellar she'd dug for vegetables in 1883, which went down 4 feet, stayed noticeably cooler than the air above it even in July. She started paying attention to temperatures. She had no thermometer, only her hands and a system she'd developed of leaving butter at different depths in the root cellar and noting where it softened and where it stayed solid. By July of 1885, she'd established, empirically, that the air 4 feet down in her root cellar was at least 25 to 30 degrees cooler than the air at the surface on the hottest days. What she was measuring, without knowing the name for it, is called the geothermal buffer. Below roughly 5 to 6 feet of depth in the northern plains, ground temperature stabilizes close to the annual mean air temperature of the region in Cass County. That's somewhere between 44 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The soil at depth doesn't experience summer. It doesn't experience winter either, not the way the surface does. It just sits at approximately the average of the whole year, all year. The practical implication for a smokehouse is this: if you smoke your meat in a chamber that's partially or fully below grade, the walls and floor of that chamber are constantly pulling heat out of the air inside. In July, when an above-ground pine smokehouse might reach 115 degrees Fahrenheit on the south side in the afternoon, an underground chamber stays cool enough for cold smoking below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, often well below. The fire never has to fight the July sun. The meat never spends 8 hours a day baking in a tiny oven. Sofie Karas had figured out the principle through butter and her bare feet in creek water. But the principle is real, measurable, and still the foundation of every serious underground cold smoker built today. She started planning the new smokehouse in February of 1886. She had a piece of paper she'd gotten from a calendar that Jiri had saved, and she drew on the back of it. She chose the low north side of a small rise about 40 yards from the barn, sheltered from the south wind, facing north so it got no direct afternoon sun, with enough slope to dig a chamber 6 feet deep without running into the water table. The design had 3 distinct parts. The first was the chamber itself, roughly 8 feet by 6 feet, dug 6 feet deep into the north face of the rise. She would line the walls with clay dug from the creek bank, the same grey-blue clay that Bohemian farmers used for floor sealing, fired slightly hard by mixing it with straw and letting it dry slowly so it didn't crack. Clay at that thickness, 2 to 3 inches, doesn't absorb or release heat quickly. It acts as a buffer, evening out temperature swings. The floor would stay bare earth. The roof would be a sod cap, 6 inches of topsoil and live grass root mass with a small vent hole in the centre that she could open or close with a flat stone. The second part was the fire pit, not inside the chamber, but 15 feet away on the ground surface, slightly elevated above the chamber, so gravity would pull air from the pit downward through a clay-lined trench and into the chamber at floor level. This was the part Lars Dybvig had laughed at most. It was also the part that most determined the whole system's success. When you put a fire pit inside a smokehouse, several things happen that you don't want. The fire consumes oxygen inside the chamber, which means you have to leave air gaps to feed it, and every air gap is a place where July heat enters. The fire radiates heat directly onto the meat. And the smoke is hot, straight off the wood smoke full of creosote and incompletely combusted particles that coat the meat in a bitter black layer that tastes like chimney tar. When you put the fire pit outside and let the smoke travel 15 feet through a clay-lined underground trench before entering the chamber, 3 things happen instead. The smoke cools, ash particles and heavy creosote condense and drop in the trench before reaching the meat, and the air feeding the fire comes from the surrounding environment, not from the chamber. So the chamber's internal oxygen level stays stable, and the meat is exposed only to cooled, partially filtered smoke. This is called an offset firebox. It is, in slightly more sophisticated form, the principle behind every competition-grade cold smoker built today. The commercial Tory kiln developed in Scotland in 1939, the device that standardized industrial cold smoking works on the same basic separation of fire source and smoking chamber, just with fans and thermostats instead of clay and a drainage trench. Sofie Karas worked out the same geometry in February of 1886 with a calendar page and a piece of charcoal. She started digging in early May, after the frost had left the ground but before the creek rose with snowmelt. She dug the chamber first, 6 feet deep, 8 by 6 feet across, using a short-handled spade because the long one didn't work well in a confined hole. The spoil from the dig went onto the uphill side of the rise, adding another foot of earth insulation above the chamber's north wall. Lars Dybvig rode by on a Tuesday morning in the second week of May. He was going to the Brandt farm for some reason Sofie never learned, and he stopped his horse at her fence line and watched her working in the hole for a long enough time that she was aware of him without looking up. "You're building it underground," he said. It was not a question. "The fire pit will be up here," she said, pointing to a spot on the surface about 15 feet north of the hole, trench between them. He looked at the spot she indicated, then at the hole. He'd been running a hardware store on the Dakota Plains for 6 years, had sold lumber and iron hooks and stovepipe to every family in the settlement. He'd seen smokehouses built from sod, from salvaged railroad ties, from the sides of collapsed barns. He'd never seen one dug into a hillside with an external fire pit connected by a trench. "Smoke rises," he said again. "It'll never get in there properly." "Smoke follows air," Sofie said, and went back to digging. He sat on his horse for another minute, then rode on. What Sofie understood, and Dybvig did not, is that smoke doesn't simply rise in a straight vertical line. It moves with air currents, and in a properly designed draft system, those air currents can be made to flow horizontally or even downward before rising in the chamber. Her chamber had a vent at the top. The fire pit had an open top. The differential pressure between the hot air rising from the fire and the cooler air inside the chamber creates a draft, a flow that pulls smoke through the trench and up through the chamber. Exactly the same physics that makes a chimney draw. This was not mysterious and not unconventional in any culture that had built kilns, ovens, or masonry stoves. The Roman hypocaust, the floor heating system found under excavated Roman baths, moved hot air through underground channels by the same pressure differential. Bohemian village bakers used masonry ovens with long flue paths that cooled smoke before it reached the bread chamber. Sofie had grown up watching her mother's neighbour use a similar principle for drying herbs. She knew it worked from observation, even without the fluid dynamics to back it up, and neither could Lars Dybvig have written them out. The difference was that she had noticed the right things. The clay lining took 2 weeks. She dug the creek clay, mixed it with wheat straw at roughly a 4-to-1 ratio, and applied it 2 inches thick to all 4 walls and the ceiling vault. She let each layer dry before applying the next. The straw reinforced the clay matrix the way rebar reinforces concrete without it. The clay would crack as it dried, and the walls would shed dust onto the hanging meat. The trench was the hardest part. 15 feet of hand-dug channel, 14 inches wide and 12 inches deep, with a clay floor and clay walls, sloping very slightly upward from the chamber toward the fire pit, so that condensed moisture would drain back toward the chamber floor rather than pooling in the trench. She lined it with broken flat stones from the creek bank where they were available, bare clay where they weren't. She capped it with sod sections, grass side up, that she cut in 9-inch widths and laid like shingles. The fire pit was the simplest part, a ring of creek stones, 18 inches in diameter, set into the ground surface at the uphill end of the trench. She built a crude damper plate from a piece of scrap iron, a cast-off pan lid from a broken cast-iron skillet that she could slide partially over the fire ring to control airflow. More air through the damper meant more draft, more smoke moving through the trench. Less air meant a slower, cooler smoke. She hung iron hooks from wooden crossbars in the chamber. 4 crossbars, 4 hooks each, 16 positions total. For her 3 hogs that spring, 2 of her own. One she'd bought from Strand in April for $2.50. She had more than enough. The sod cap went on last. She laid it thick, 8 inches of sod, another 4 inches of loose topsoil on top, and she planted a row of grass seed along the ridge to bind it. When it was done, from 20 feet away on the flat ground, you could not see the smokehouse at all. It looked like a slight thickening of the hillside, with a cluster of stones at the upper end where the fire pit was. Lars Dybvig, passing again 3 weeks later, looked at the hillside and looked at Sofie and said, "Is it finished?" 3 weeks ago," she said. He shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head when he's decided not to waste further argument on someone who isn't listening. "A mole's den," he said. He didn't say it to be cruel, exactly. He said it the way you say something when you've made a prediction, and you still expect it to come true. You just haven't gotten the news yet. "I'm going to smoke 4 hogs in there this fall," Sofie said. "Come back in November and tell me what you think." He did not come back in November. To understand what happened that summer, why her meat held and the others, didn't you need to understand exactly what goes wrong inside a hot, above-ground smokehouse in a Dakota July? Meat spoils through bacterial action. The bacteria responsible, the ones that make meat smell foul, turn it grey-green, generate the toxins that make people sick, all need moisture to grow. Specifically, they need free moisture. Water molecules that aren't locked up in salt crystals or evaporated by heat or bound to protein surfaces. Food scientists measure this as water activity, written as a W, on a scale from 0 to 1. Fresh raw meat sits at roughly a W0.99. Most dangerous bacteria can't grow below a W0.91. Staphylococcus aureus, one of the nastiest spoilage agents, stops producing toxins below a W0.85. A properly salt-cured, cold-smoked country ham finishes at a W0.82 to 0.86, just inside the margin of safety, but enough. The problem with high temperature is this: it doesn't kill the bacteria in cold-smoked meat the way it would in a fully cooked product. Cold smoking means keeping the chamber below roughly 90 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to move smoke through, not warm enough to cook the protein. But above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, something starts to happen to the fat in the meat. It begins to render to liquefy, and when fat liquefies, it opens pathways for moisture to migrate through the meat. Salt that was concentrated near the surface where you applied it starts diluting as moisture moves. The water activity at the surface rises. Bacteria that couldn't grow at a W0.84 suddenly find themselves at a W0.91, and at that point, in a hot summer smokehouse, they have weeks of warmth to work in. The settlement's above-ground pine smokehouses were hitting temperatures that no amount of hickory smoke could compensate for. Pine boards, half an inch thick, have essentially no thermal mass. They heat as fast as the air around them. On a south-facing wall on a 103 degrees Fahrenheit July afternoon with full sun, the interior of a pine smokehouse can reach 115, 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The hams hanging inside don't care about the smoke anymore. They're slow cooking, and the fat is moving, and the salt can't keep up. Sofie's underground chamber, on a 103 degrees Fahrenheit July day, was holding steady at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. That number is not an estimate, it follows directly from the physics. 6 feet of earth above a Dakota Plains chamber, with clay walls pulling heat from the air and a north-facing orientation keeping direct sun off the vent, produces a temperature profile that closely tracks the geothermal baseline of the soil. In Cass County, North Dakota, that baseline is 44 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. With a small, low-temperature hickory fire in the external pit enough to generate smoke, not heat the chamber air, would rise perhaps 8 to 12 degrees above the soil baseline, somewhere in the range of 55 to 62 degrees Fahrenheit. At 58 degrees Fahrenheit, with properly salt-cured meat, the water activity at the surface stays right where she'd put it, below 0.86. The fat does not render, and the salt stays where it was applied. The phenolic compounds in the hickory smoke the guaiacols and syringols that deposit on the meat's surface as it dries, form a waxy, slightly antiseptic pellicle that blocks further bacterial entry. The smoke kills surface bacteria and then forms a barrier against new ones. The hams age rather than rot. There's a difference, and it matters. Above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat and the migrating moisture accelerate the wrong kind of microbial activity. Below 65 degrees Fahrenheit, the right kind of chemistry takes over slow, controlled enzymatic changes that concentrate flavor and drive water activity lower over weeks and months. Properly cold smoked and aged country ham develops its deep color, its dry texture, its complex flavor through this slow chemistry. Rush it with heat, and you get putrefaction instead of charcuterie. Oscar Brandt's hams had been rushed through that process, and Sofie's had not. She smoked her first batch in May of 1886, before the summer heat came. 3 hogs worth 9 hams, 14 slabs of bacon, assorted shoulders and jowls. She'd salted them in late April, using the same ratio her mother had used, roughly 1 1/4 ounces of salt cure per pound of meat, packed heavily into the hock cavities and around the exposed bone at the hip socket. She'd learned from Jerry's mother, in Bohemia, that the hip socket was where hams went wrong, too much dense muscle around too much exposed bone, and if the salt didn't penetrate to the center of the joint before smoking, the deep tissue would sour from the inside out, while the surface looked perfect. She'd rubbed the cure in herself, massaged it into every fold and cavity, and then hung the hams in the sod house near the north wall where the temperature stayed coldest, for 2 weeks before moving them to the smokehouse. She burned hickory and not pine. There was no good reason to use pine, and every reason not to. Pine resin produces acrid compounds that coat meat in a black, bitter layer that she'd tasted once on smoked pork from a family in the settlement who'd run out of hardwood in March and burned what they had. The result had been edible but wrong, harsh and tarry where good smoked pork should be sweet, sharp and clean. Hickory was harder to get in Dakota Territory than it had been in Bohemia or in the American East. She'd traded a half bushel of wheat for 2 wagon loads of green cut hardwood from a man coming through who'd logged along the Cheyenne River. She let it season, stacked in the barn, from November through April. Dry hardwood burns cleaner, less creosote, more of the lighter phenolic compounds that do the actual preservative work, fewer of the heavy aromatic hydrocarbons that just taste bad and don't extend shelf life. Her fire was small by design. The goal was smoke, not heat. A fire big enough to fill her palm, sustained for 12 hours a day for 10 days. She'd open the damper plate in the morning, let the draft establish, and check the vent over the chamber every hour or 2. When smoke was rising from the vent in a thin, white-grey stream, the draft was working. When the smoke turned dark yellow or brown, the fire was too hot or too wet, and she'd adjust. After 10 days of cold smoking, she left the hams hanging in the closed chamber for 6 more weeks to equalize, to let the surface cure and the interior cure reach the same salt concentration, which they couldn't do when the meat was still fresh and moving moisture rapidly. By the end of June, the hams were firm. The surface was dry to the touch, the color of old mahogany, with a thin, waxy coating that came off on your finger as a faintly tacky residue. That residue was the smoke pellicle phenolic compounds and organic acids that had polymerized on the surface over weeks. It felt like almost nothing to the touch, but it was functioning as a seal against further bacterial entry. When July came and the temperature climbed to 103 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 11 days, nothing happened to Sofie's hams. The chamber temperature rose by 3 degrees. The vent stayed closed, and the hams kept aging. The Brandt family's smokehouse failed around the 2nd week of August. Oscar Brandt had built it the previous year, after the old one blew down in a spring windstorm. He'd built it from rough-cut pine boards, 4 walls and a peaked roof, with a small firebox in the southeast corner, because that was where he'd put the draft hole. on the recommendation of the man who sold him the iron firebox grate, and the roof had no overhang. The south wall got direct afternoon sun from noon to 5. He'd smoked with what he had, which was mostly cottonwood, the only tree in abundance on the Dakota plains, and cottonwood burns wet and smoky, in a way that deposits more creosote than hickory, but doesn't lay down the same phenolic defense. He checked his hams in mid-August because the smell coming from the smokehouse had changed. Not obviously wrong, smokehouses have a particular smell that can mask early spoilage, a strong odour that makes the nose miss subtleties. But something in the back of his nose had been registering something different for 3 days, and on the 14th he went in with a lantern. The hams nearest the south wall had gone grey on the cut surfaces. He pressed his thumb into one, and it gave too easily the texture of something cooked incompletely and left to cool in humidity, rather than the firm, dry resistance of properly cured meat. When he cut into it, the flesh was grey throughout. The fat was soft and had clearly migrated. The bone at the hip socket was dark bone sour, the condition where the joint goes bad from the inside out before the cure had fully penetrated. A combination of the hot smokehouse warming the meat and accelerating bacterial action before the salt could reach the centre, and an initial cure that probably hadn't been massaged deeply enough into the hip socket cavity. The other 3 hams were in varying states. 2 were borderline, probably safe to eat if cooked immediately, but not safe to age further, and 2 were clearly lost. He told Reinhardt at the September community gathering. Reinhardt had had a similar experience, though he'd caught his earlier and salvaged 4 of his 6 hams by cutting away the suspect surfaces and rendering the rest into lard. Magnuson, who'd built his smokehouse on the south-facing wall of his barn where it got reflected heat from the barn roof as well as direct sun, had lost his entire spring cure 6 hams, 2 sides of bacon, 4 shoulders. This is the conversation where someone mentioned, eventually and reluctantly, that Sofie Karas was said to have good meat from her underground smokehouse. Lars Dybvig, who was at the gathering, said nothing for a while. Then he said that underground smokehouses were impractical because the smoke doesn't circulate properly. He'd said this in May, and he saw no reason to revise it now. Oscar Brandt said, quietly, that he'd lost 4 hams, and he'd like to know how her method worked, and Dybvig left the gathering before the conversation went further. Brandt came to Sofie's farm on the 2nd day of October. He came alone, in the morning, and he stood at her fence line the way Dybvig had stood there in May, looking at the hillside. She came out to meet him. "Show me how it works," he said. She took him to the fire pit, showed him the damper plate, showed him the sod-capped trench, opened the chamber vent, and let him put his hand over it to feel the temperature of the air coming up from below. She opened the chamber door, a heavy, sod-faced frame she'd built from salvaged lumber, hinged with leather straps, and let him stand in the opening and look at the hams. He was quiet for a long time. "The bottom of the hill is cooler," he said finally. "The earth is cooler," she said. "The bottom of the hill gives me depth without flooding. The clay walls hold the coolness. The fire pit outside keeps the heat separate from the chamber." He looked at the trench line, still visible as a slight ridge in the grass. "The smoke goes through the trench, and then up?" "Draft, same as a chimney, but horizontal first." She pointed to the vent. "Fire heats air, air rises from the pit, cooler air from the chamber is pulled in to replace it. The smoke follows the air." He stood there considering this for a moment. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had built things the way his father had built them, in Wisconsin, and his father had built them the way his father had built them in Germany. Nobody had needed to think about whether the physics of the system still held when you moved the system to a place where July was 15 degrees hotter than anything the family had previously experienced. "I want to rebuild mine before spring," he said. She told him what she'd learned. The depth get below 5 feet if the water table allows. The clay lining not mud, clay, and mix straw into it. The fire pit placement uphill and north if possible, never inside, never on the south side. The wood hardwood only, seasoned, never resinous pine. She told him about the cure, the importance of packing salt into the hip socket, the 14-day cure in cold conditions before smoking, the 6-week equalization after smoking. He listened carefully and wrote nothing down, the way men of that time and place often processed information in the body first, hands learning by doing later. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it plainly. In November, Lars Dybvig came to Sofie's farm on foot, not on horseback, which meant he'd walked the 2 miles from the settlement, which meant it wasn't a casual visit. He stood at the fence for a moment, then came through the gate without waiting to be invited, not rudely, just in the way people do when they've talked themselves into something and don't want to lose the momentum of having arrived. "I'd like to buy some of your pork," he said, "at a fair price." "What price do you think is fair?" she asked. He offered 7 cents a pound for salt pork. The market price in Fargo that month was 9 cents, so she told him she would take 9, and he paid it. She sold him 40 pounds of salt pork from her cash, which left her enough through the winter with room to spare. She watched him walk back toward the settlement with the cloth sack over his shoulder. She'd said, in May, that she was going to smoke 4 hogs in her new smokehouse. She'd actually smoked 3, but she didn't correct him on that point. It hadn't mattered what number she'd said. He hadn't believed any of them. The autumn of 1886 and the spring of 1887 saw 5 families in the Elm Creek settlement rebuild their smokehouses according to variations of the underground design. Not all of them got it exactly right. Brant's rebuild was too shallow. He'd hit clay-rich soil at 4 feet that he didn't want to dig through, so he went 4 feet instead of 6. And his summer temperature was still climbing into the upper 70s degrees Fahrenheit on the hottest days, but it held. Reinhardt got his depth right, but used pine boards for the wall lining instead of clay, and the boards absorbed moisture and started to mold in the second summer. He relined with clay the following spring. Magnusson built his external fire pit. On the wrong side, he put it south of the chamber, which meant the prevailing summer wind pushed hot air back toward the fire rather than pulling draft through the trench. On calm days his system worked. On windy days the draft reversed. He didn't fix this for 2 years. Sofie's held through every summer from 1886 to 1891, when she sold the claim and moved to Fargo. By then she had a reputation that extended to farms she'd never visited, based on nothing more complicated than having 9 good hams in September when everyone else had none. The local newspaper in the settlement, a 2-page sheet printed by a man named Hartman on a press that smelled permanently of linseed oil, ran a brief item in its October 1886 issue, noting that the widow Karas had an unusual method of meat preservation that has attracted some local attention. It did not describe the method, because Hartman had not visited to ask. He'd heard about it at the community gathering and written it down from memory. He misspelled her name as Karas. She never corrected it. Here's what the settlers were discovering without having the words for it, in the autumn of 1886. That preservation is chemistry, and chemistry responds to conditions. The conditions inside a traditional above-ground pine smokehouse on the Dakota Plains in July were conditions that no amount of salt and smoke could fully compensate for conditions where the ambient temperature was pushing the wrong kind of microbial activity faster than the preservatives could work. This was not a failure of skill. Oscar Brandt and Carl Reinhardt were not careless or lazy men. They were doing what they knew how to do in conditions where what they knew wasn't quite enough. They'd imported a technology, the above-ground timber smokehouse, from climates where July highs were 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and deployed it in a climate where July highs were 103 degrees Fahrenheit. The technology failed at the margin. Sofie Karas hadn't known any chemistry either. She'd known that deep earth stays cool when the surface gets hot. She'd known that an external firebox means cooler smoke. She'd known that smoke needs to move, needs draft, and that draft is a matter of pressure differential, not magic. She'd known that clay holds temperature where pine boards don't. She'd assembled these pieces from memory and observation, and the particular kind of problem-solving that comes from knowing that if the system fails, there's nothing behind it, no backup, no second option, no family to call on for the winter. That kind of problem-solving comes from knowing that if the system fails, there is nothing behind it, no backup and no alternative source, no family close enough to call on for the winter, and no room to treat the question as anything other than arithmetic. The chemistry she'd worked out empirically is worth understanding completely, because it's still the chemistry running inside every serious cure house and cold smoker in the world today. Salt preservation works by osmosis. When you pack salt onto a piece of meat, the salt draws moisture from the meat's surface through the cell membranes of the surface tissue. The salt outside is drier, so water migrates toward it, which is how osmosis always works. Over time, this salt and water mixture penetrates inward, first along the connective tissue pathways, then more slowly through muscle fiber. As it goes, it raises the concentration of dissolved solids inside the meat's cells, which is what reduces water activity. The free water, the water that bacteria could use, gets tied up in the salt solution and becomes biochemically unavailable. The problem with heat is that it accelerates all of this, including the parts you don't want accelerated. Bacteria also use osmotic pathways. At elevated temperatures, bacterial metabolism runs faster. The Q10 rule in biology says that reaction rates roughly double for every 10 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. A smokehouse at 115 degrees Fahrenheit is running the clock on spoilage bacteria at roughly 4 to 8 times the rate of a smokehouse at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The salt cure is still working, but so are the bacteria, and at high temperatures the bacteria can outpace the cure. The smoke compounds add their own layer of protection. Phenols, specifically guaiacol, syringol, and their derivatives are antimicrobial because they disrupt bacterial cell membranes. They're also antioxidant, which matters for the fat. Fat that oxidizes goes rancid, the process familiar to anyone who's smelled old lard, and rancidity happens faster at high temperatures. The phenols in wood smoke slow lipid oxidation the same way they slow bacterial activity, by breaking the chemical chain reaction before it can run to completion. Organic acids in smoke, acetic acid, formic acid, and others lower the pH of the meat's surface. Most spoilage bacteria grow best between pH 6 and 7. Lowering the surface pH to 5 or 5.5 creates an additional obstacle. Each of these is a modest obstacle on its own, but layered together they make survival difficult for the bacteria that cause spoilage. The pellicle, the waxy, slightly tacky surface layer that forms on properly smoked meat, is the physical manifestation of all these compounds depositing and polymerizing on the meat surface. A good pellicle is the sign that cold smoking has worked. It has the texture of waxed leather and blocks further bacterial entry while sealing the smoke compounds against the meat surface. It's the reason properly cured country ham can hang in a cool space for a year without refrigeration. For the pellicle to form properly, the smoke has to be cool. Hot smoke deposits compounds too fast and too thickly. You get the black creosote layer that tastes bitter and doesn't actually work as well as the thin, evenly deposited layer from cool, partially filtered smoke. This is the paradox of good cold smoking. The fire has to be far enough from the meat that the smoke cools and the heavy particles drop out, but close enough that the smoke still reaches the meat with enough concentration to do its work. The 15-foot trench was Sofie's answer to this paradox. Mary Dodge Woodward, a North Dakota widow who kept a diary of her farm operations from 1884 to 1888, recorded in her October 1886 entry that a neighbor woman had very good preserved pork this season, better than any we've seen. She named neither the neighbor nor the method, and the diary entry moves on to the next day's wheat prices and a note about the quality of the season's first snow. The observation was genuine, the pork was real, and the contrast with what everyone else had put up that year was not a small difference. By the spring of 1887, the question of how to build a smokehouse in Dakota Territory had gotten specific enough that the settlement's informal networks, the conversations at the hardware store, the notes passed at community gatherings had converged on a set of principles that looked a great deal like what Sofie had arrived at independently. The principles that had emerged were: depth matters more than size. Clay or earthen walls hold temperature better than pine boards. The fire pit belongs outside on an offset flue rather than inside. The orientation should be north-facing or shaded, and the wood should be seasoned hardwood burned in a small controlled fire. None of this was published, and there was no manual, no authority had written it down. It was simply the accumulated understanding of people who'd had a bad summer and talked to each other about what had worked. The same process, in the same period, was happening in Westphalia, in the Appalachian Highlands, in Scandinavia. Every culture that cured pork in regions with hot summers had independently discovered that cooling the smoke and stabilizing the chamber temperature were the two variables that mattered most. The Westphalian Schinken chamber was a multi-story masonry building designed to keep the upper smoking floor cool by mass and ventilation. The Appalachian Smokehouse, on a shaded north slope, was a different implementation of the same idea. Sofie's sod-capped underground chamber was another. The underlying physics produces the same result, regardless of where it is implemented. In September of 1887, Sofie Karas sent a letter to her mother's sister in Bohemia that has not been preserved, but we know from the response a letter that did survive in the collection of the Colfax County Historical Archive. Misfiled under a different surname and found in the 1970s that the letter described the smokehouse in some detail, because the aunt's reply asks clarifying questions about the clay lining and the length of the trench. The aunt was also building one. She wrote, "You described the trench as 15 feet. Our hill is not long enough for 15 feet. Can it be 12? And what mix do you use for the clay? Does it need the wheat straw, or will barley straw do?" Sofie wrote back. That letter is also not preserved. But the question of whether barley straw works as well as wheat straw in clay reinforcement is a real question with a real answer. Yes, it does. Clay reinforcement with organic fibre depends on the fibre's tensile strength and its ability to bind the clay matrix as it dries. Wheat and barley straw are functionally identical for this purpose. Either works, and Sofie Karas knew this because she'd tested it in 1885 on a small section of wall that she later relined. She hadn't known she was doing materials science. She'd just known that she didn't always have enough wheat straw, and she'd wondered whether barley straw would do. Barley straw worked just as well. She sold the claim in the spring of 1891 for $340, the land itself and the improvements on it. The buyer was a Norwegian family named Aslaksen who'd arrived the previous autumn. She left the smokehouse intact, showed the family how to operate it, and moved to Fargo to work in a dry goods store. She'd proven up 3 years early by the calculation of improvements. She had a substantial sod house, a frame barn, the smokehouse, 80 acres under cultivation, and a small kitchen garden that she'd enclosed with a wood-post fence in 1888. The homestead law required 5 years of residence and proof of improvements. The improvements officer who came out in 1890 had found no difficulty in certifying the claim. Lars Dybvig, for what it's worth, had rebuilt his own smokehouse in the fall of 1887. He'd built it largely underground, with an external fire pit on the north side. He'd used clay lining on the east and west walls, not all 4, but 2. His results that summer were considerably better than 1886, though he lost one ham to a drainage problem that let water seep into the trench during the spring thaw. He didn't attribute the improvement to anything Sofie had told Brandt. He'd worked it out for himself, he said. Perhaps he had arrived at it independently. The principle was not proprietary, it was just physics that anyone could observe if they were looking at the right things. If you dug a hole 6 feet deep in Cass County, North Dakota this morning, the temperature at the bottom would be approximately 46 degrees Fahrenheit. It would be 46 degrees Fahrenheit in January, in July, in September, always, or close enough to always, that the difference doesn't matter for the purpose of keeping meat cold. The soil at that depth has not experienced this winter. It has not experienced last summer. It is sitting at the average of all the years it has accumulated, insulated from surface variation by its own mass and the mass of everything above it. This is free refrigeration that has always been there, and every settler in Cass County in 1886 was standing directly on top of it without giving it a thought, and Sofie Karas did. The principle she applied: stabilize the chamber temperature by getting it below grade, separate the heat source from the smoking chamber, use cool, dense walls to buffer temperature swings, is not dated. Modern cold smokers run on the same logic. The USDA's current standards for dry-cured country ham still recognize room temperature shelf stability for products that reach the right combination of water activity and salt content, the same threshold Sofie was. Working without a hygrometer or a food science textbook, in a sod-capped hillside in Dakota Territory in 1886. The Aslakson family used her smokehouse until 1923, when they built a new frame structure on higher ground with a concrete floor. By that point, mechanical refrigeration was becoming available to rural farms, and the smokehouse's role as a preservation technology was contracting. And by the 1950s, almost no farm in North Dakota ran a cold smoking operation for preservation. Smoking had become a matter of flavor, and the actual preserving was done by a Frigidaire. But the physics in the hill did not change, the geothermal baseline did not change, and the chemistry of phenolic compounds and water activity and salt diffusion did not change. The knowledge of how to use them is what got lost. Sofie Karas didn't write it down. Oscar Brandt didn't write it down. The man at the hardware store in Fargo who sold Brandt his clay mixing tools didn't write it down. It moved person to person, farm to farm, through the particular transmission system of people who needed to know and people who'd figured it out. When Sofie moved to Fargo in 1891, she took the knowledge with her and used it there, in a small lot behind the house she eventually bought on 3rd Street. And she built a version of the underground smokehouse against the north face of a retaining wall the previous owner had built against the alley bank. Smaller than the Elm Creek version, 8 feet of trench instead of 15, a 3-foot deep chamber instead of 6, but the same underlying logic. She smoked pork there every autumn until 1914, when she was 62 years old and her hands hurt too much to do the heavy work. Her neighbor, a woman named Elise Nygaard, had been watching her do it for 20 years and asked to learn before Sofie stopped. Sofie spent an afternoon with her explaining the trench and the draft and the clay and the depth and the wood. Elise Nygaard kept the smokehouse running until 1929. When the house was sold, nobody wrote it down.